Okay, welcome back, everybody. This is Dr. Dan, and we are following up with our second interview with Laura Bartchak for our Fight for Freedom fundraiser that we're doing at the office this month. Again, what we're doing is we're raising money with your help to help victims of sex trafficking here in Ohio. And Laura and her organization, the Harriet Tubman Movement, are our recipients. They're going to help us to make this money put into action so we can help these victims. And so we're going to recap a little bit about what we talked about last week, and we're going to move forward this week. So before I do that, I'm going to have Laura reintroduce herself to you.
Hi, I'm Laura Bartchak. I am the co-founder and director of the Harriet Tubman Movement, and we are a group of advocates that work in Northeast Ohio directly with local victims of human trafficking. And we work with people anywhere from Elyria to Ashtabula to Summit County and Canton, all over the region, over to Youngstown. And we certainly appreciate this opportunity. We appreciate so much the fundraiser that Dan is doing with his team, and we're really excited to be here today. So thank you.
Awesome, thank you. So a quick recap from last time. We learned, I think there's going to be a new information for a lot of people, that really when we're talking about trafficking, we're talking about any coercion into forced exploitation or labor of any sort that can happen. Anyone who is essentially a victim of that exploitation. And in Ohio, we find ourselves the fourth largest state for trafficking in the country, specifically sex trafficking, which really is any form of forced prostitution that happens to an adult or a minor that is happening in a huge rate in Ohio. And one thing we touched on last week is this mechanism of control that the victimizer has over the victim. And so I'm going to start with asking Laura to extrapolate, if you would, on how are these victims being held hostage, essentially, especially maybe the adults who aren't stuck at home like a child would be, or in both and, I should say. And I'll let you talk on that. So tell us a little bit about this control that these victimizers have on their victims.
Sure. Probably the most frequent question we get is, why don't they just leave? And so sometimes I'll just come back to that person asking the question and say, were you ever at a job that you absolutely hated? Or were you ever in a relationship that, was just not good and you knew that it just was not good? And what kept you in that situation? So oftentimes with jobs, it's because it's what it's comfortable, it seems to be easier just to put up with a bad job than to change jobs. You don't maybe know what else is out there, or this is the only thing that you know how to do. And so there's multiple factors of keeping you in a bad job, or you don't know if switching jobs, if maybe you get one that's even worse. And with relationships, a lot of times, especially if you're living together, you don't know if you can make it out on your own financially. Trying to find a place to rent these days that's affordable is really hard. Or maybe you're afraid of being alone or afraid of your partner's reaction if you were to leave. So I think most adults with any years under their belt can relate to kind of being stuck in a situation, whether it's a job or a relationship where it's, just really kind of hard to leave. Take that and, put it on steroids. And that's oftentimes what our trafficking survivors are facing. Generally, they don't have to be, chained in a basement or, have their hands tied in ropes, which are often the images that we see on the internet around trafficking. But we know that there are multiple forms of control that are being used against the victim. So what we see sometimes is a lot of mind games going on that people are manipulated or coerced into thinking they're in a relationship with this person who then wants them to perform in certain ways to get some money for. Many times it's for their drugs. Some people have literally grown up in a culture where working the streets is expected of them, which sounds weird in the United States, but there really are, we have seen like family units who, you know, this is kind of what they do. Oftentimes somebody has multiple forms of control. Like I said, they have control over their money. They'll use control of their children to make somebody do what they want them to do, threats of or actual physical violence. But I think the number one form of control that we see is addictions. And so drug addictions, either as a form to control someone or as a method to cope with the lifestyle that they're in or the situation that they're in, are often a huge element of what we see in trafficking control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to echo some of that as well. You know, on any level of function or dysfunction, when someone's experiencing trauma, which is something that really all of us deal with, there are very specific brain circuits that will force us back into the same habits that kind of led down that road to trauma to begin with, even if we know it's no good. And to kind of tie that together with addiction, you know, how many of us have habits that we feel addicted to? Shopping, watching, looking at our phones, maybe it's drinking, maybe it's smoking cigarettes that we wish we could quit. Sugar, heck, I mean, gosh, what an addictive habit sugar is. And if we can't, we know it's not good, and yet we find ourselves going back to it over and over and over again. It's such a small thing, like you said, with a job or a relationship. So if that's a small thing that we don't have control over, and we find ourselves going back to, when the trauma is exploded and it's even more effect on the neurology, which folks in our office know all about that, right, guys? So if we find ourselves having a hard time changing our habits and our behavior because our own trauma gets in the way of that, you can imagine, I think, and have a lot of compassion for folks who are in a much worse situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Yeah. So just to kind of clarify then, you know, in Ohio, you know, again, we might have this big image of these international trafficking rings that are going on, but really is it mostly what we're seeing is drug addicted individuals selling their girlfriends, sisters, daughters for, you know, or sons and, you know, whatnot for drugs, for sex and drugs, right? Is that true?
Yeah, it's just more common than you would think. And it's, yeah, we see it more on a local. We have certainly seen large trafficking rings that sort of have franchises throughout the state. I'm not even kidding. But more often what we see is pretty localized, people that are maybe selling drugs, but then also supplementing that drug business with some women on the side. We had a law enforcement officer explain that, you know, if you get caught with, you know, a large amount of drugs, you're going to be going away for a long time. So, you know, having a small amount of drugs, stealing that, and having a couple girls on the side that you're sort of controlling and, you know, playing with their emotions and, you know, hey, baby, this is just for a little while, you know, you're my favorite. This is just to get us on our feet. You know, that often is being seen now, where there's multiple forms of trafficking between drug trafficking and people trafficking. You know, and like you said, addictions, whether it's, you know, sugar, alcohol, you know, drugs, when you have that element present, suddenly you find that people will do things to feed that addiction that they most normally would not do. In the extreme cases of what we have seen, you know, people, you know, selling their children for drug money. You know, it's really tragic. But more often it's people trading sex for drugs, or having their girlfriend, you know, or, you know, several girls, you know, working for them, and, you know, maybe splitting the money, which, you know, it's all coercion. It's all a form of force, you know, forcing someone into that situation and forcing people into prostitution.
Mm-hmm. I like that you're putting the two next to each other. It's really important to understand that coercion is force, right? It's a form of forcing someone to do something. So just as bad as tying them up, right? Which is this,
Right.
you know, not unrealistic, but not as common scenario, right? So now we're talking a lot about what you're talking about. Sounds a lot like prostitution. And it's not uncommon to hear people talk about legalizing prostitution as a way to kind of make it less dangerous, or look at countries who've legalized it. Look, then the crime rate goes down. Is that true? Should we look at prostitution as something that should be made legal, or what do you think about that?
So I love this topic because this is also another thing that we hear a lot. And so researchers started to do studies on just how consenting the adults are, because we hear, prostitution is two consenting adults, right? So the Ohio State Moritz College of Law conducted a survey, and they came up with parameters to say, is this trafficking, using the elements of force, fraud, or coercion, or is this prostitution of a person's free will? They get to keep the money. And they interviewed women arrested for prostitution in Ohio jails, and 92% fell under the parameters of trafficking. So, people are not labeling themselves as being a trafficking victim. They are, generally, they don't love hearing the words prostitution, but so if you think, we talked about Ohio having the fourth highest number of reported cases in the nation, yet 92% of women sitting in Ohio jails are labeled as prostitutes, not labeled as trafficking victims. Wow. And then I know from our clients, we have many that have not entered the legal system. They have not been classified as being trafficked. So those numbers are unreported. So if you think of underreported and not reported in a state that has the fourth highest number of reported cases, you just start to get an idea that, wow, this problem is a lot bigger than we're even seeing. So getting back though to prostitution, we also hear like, oh, it's the oldest profession in the book, and yeah, it should be legalized. So I take that thought and I extend it, and I say, okay, so if this should be legalized, then it would be a legalized profession, right? And people say, oh yes, it would be regulated. You can make sure people get good health checkups and everything. And I say, okay, well then at your kid's career day, you would go to high school or junior high, because, I remember career day was 8th grade for me. And you have these tables set up and they talk about careers. And so you would have a table saying, hey, be a prostitute. So, what would that job description look like? That you would, have sex with 20 strangers a night? That, what skills would you have to be good at to be good in your career? I mean, it's absurd if you start going down that line, and I'll stop there because I can go on further. But, it really, really, look at that line of reasoning. In what we're doing, we have never met a woman or a man or a transgender individual who is working in prostitution who loves their job, who loves going to work every day and doesn't want to get out and do something else. But every person that we have interacted with feels trapped in this situation, either economically or by addictions, and they all feel like they have no way out, that nobody cares, that they have nobody to help them. And that's where we come in as the Harriet Tubman movement. And we let people know, that's a lie. There are people who care. There is help for you. And, certainly if you want a way out, that we would walk along that road to freedom and to help with, those choices and direct you to the appropriate places for you to go to get the help, to get out of that lifestyle.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's super, a lot to think about, very clarifying. It's intense, right? And I expect
I get very passionate about this. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is. I expect everyone who's listening to this video that you feel that intensity. I mean, this isn't supposed to be a happy-go-lucky thing, but it's that's why it's exciting that we're raising this money to help you. It's exciting that you're doing this mission. It's this important work, maybe even some of the most important work. I think it is some of the most important work that can be done. And so, yeah, I really appreciate that we can kind of help to clarify some misconceptions and really point out how much of a shift in our mentality we need to have as a society, and really help people understand the extent of what's going on to really start to make the impact that needs to be made. And I appreciate everything you're doing. We're going to come back. We're going to have another interview and talk about what kind of things you are doing now, what you see yourselves doing in the future, and how the money that we raise can be helpful for that mission to move forward. So look forward to talking to you next week, and look forward to everyone tuning in for the next interview. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you.
Absolutely.